Part 3. The Gift of Unity. A God who loves his creation. There is one obvious element of the prologue that I have entirely failed to mention, but this was deliberate. This is the enduring presence of John the Baptist throughout. He appears in verses 6 through 8, again in verse 15, and after the prologue concludes, is the focus of verses 19 through 35. Having spoken about verses 1 through 18, I want to move on to verse 19, and following now, namely, the scenes surrounding John the Baptist which immediately follow the prologue, and in doing so, I will gesture back to those verses of the prologue which have until now been passed over in silence. The first lesson that we receive through John the Baptist is one that goes unspoken. Namely, the writer of the Gospel is not able to speak about the coming of the incarnate Word into the world without referring also to John the Baptist, who prepared his way into the hearts of his people. In other words, the destiny of John the Baptist and the mystery of Jesus have become inseparably intertwined. John belongs to the Son, utterly and radically. And therefore, even though John is not the Christ, and he says very strongly that he is not, he cannot be separated from Christ, and in a way, Christ cannot be separated from him. When God enters into this world, he involves himself in the lives of unique individuals, and in a way, God's own destiny becomes bound up with the creatures to whom he has united himself. We see this most clearly in the Virgin Mary. Ever since the Incarnation, it has been impossible to approach the child without the mother. For there is no child without a mother. Without Mary's yes, there would be no incarnation at all. And by knitting together the humanity of his own Son within the womb of Mary, God the Father has knitted his own heart forevermore into the heart and flesh of humanity, and into the heart and flesh of this unique woman too. It is impossible, therefore, to wrench Christ out of the arms of Mary without losing both mother and child. This makes me think of a quote from G.K. Chesterton. When I was a boy, a more Puritan generation objected to a statue upon my parish church representing the Virgin and Child. After much controversy, they compromised by taking away the child. One would think that this was even more corrupted with Mariolatry, unless the mother was counted less dangerous when deprived of a sort of weapon. But the practical difficulty is also a parable. You cannot chip away the statue of a mother from all around that of a newborn child. You cannot suspend the newborn child in midair. Indeed, you cannot really have a statue of a newborn child at all. Similarly, you cannot suspend the idea of a newborn child in the void or think of him without thinking of his mother. You cannot visit the child without visiting the mother. You cannot, in common human life, approach the child except through the mother. If we are to think of Christ in this aspect at all, the other idea follows as it is followed in history. We must either leave Christ out of Christmas, or Christmas out of Christ. Or we must admit, if only as we admitted in an old picture, that those holy heads are too near together for the hallows not to mingle and cross. Chesterton also says beautifully elsewhere, Mary leads us to Christ, but Christ leads us back to his mother, for without Mary, Jesus would become a mere abstraction to us. Does not all of this tie in with what I have said previously about the reality of inscape? In other words, the import for us is this. In order to approach God, I must take the same path by which he first came to me. On my own, I cannot ascend into the celestial realms. I cannot strip away my flesh and my human limitations and make myself, by the force of my own will, an angel or a god. Rather, I can only hope to draw near to the invisible one because he has first opened a door into this invisibility. Indeed, because he has become visible in his very invisibility, and close in his very transcendence. Christ is the road that brings me to God, because he has first brought God to me. As he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. John chapter 14, verse 6. I therefore do not find God somehow beyond Christ, as if Christ was only a pointer to something beyond himself. Rather, God lives within Christ, just as Christ lives within the Father, The incarnate Son of God, the very humanity of Christ, is truest, and most perfect inscape, for which all other inscapes of creation prepare my heart, and to which they lead. He is truly the bounded infinity, which, to touch, is to touch the very mystery of God. Yet this is not only true of the humanity of Christ, but, in a different sense, of humanity as a whole, and of the humanity of unique individuals who have been touched and grasped by divine grace. When Christ came into the world, he did not superadd something extra onto an already complete nature. Rather, nature itself is, and has always been, inherently open to grace, to what is beyond nature. In other words, to the supernatural. And so when he came and was conceived within the womb of Mary, he brought the supernatural. Yes, but he also brought the only true fulfillment of nature itself. This fulfillment of nature is none other than a marriage with the supernatural, a wedding with the divine through grace and love. Thus Christ's presence, the very presence of the uncreated God at the heart of creation, restores creation to its own integrity and dignity, which was fractured through sin. At the same time, his presence also surpasses creation into the uncreated mystery of God, but it surpasses in such a way that it doesn't strip off nature, doesn't leave it behind, but rather lifts it up and espouses it forever to the very mystery of infinity and eternity. This is how the natural inscapes of creation are brought to their true beauty and fulfillment, not by being left behind, but by being espoused to God, being made partakers in the life of God within Christ. We need think only of Christ's own experience of creation. When he looked out across a field of grain as he traveled with his disciples, who was looking? God himself was looking lovingly upon his creation through the eyes of Christ, and through the creation, Christ saw the beauty of his own Father present and reflected. When Christ reached out and touched the woman caught in adultery, who was touching her? God himself was touching her in the tender touch of Christ. And when the beloved disciple leaned against that human breast, rising and falling with its inhalation and exhalation, with a real flesh and blood heart encased within the rib cage, whose heart was he leaning against? It was the very heart of God, the heart of the Trinity throbbing and pulsating with eternal love. To touch Christ, therefore, is to touch the infinite and eternal, and this occurs not by abstracting from Christ to some God beyond. No, God is found at the very core of the being of Christ, in all the concreteness of who he is, what he does, what he feels, and what he says. Again, Christ is the living exegesis of God, and when we draw near to this exegesis, to this outpouring of eternal love, we find ourselves drawn within, in an eisegesis of love, into the very bosom of the eternal Father. But what does this have to do with John the Baptist? A lot. I said that when God involves himself with our history, he doesn't just unite himself to a generic or abstract human nature, nor just to the irreplaceable humanity of Christ. Rather, he espouses himself to every unique human person who has ever lived or who ever will live. And whenever hearts open themselves to this union, their very life becomes grafted onto his in loving relationship. He lives in them, and they live in him. And we cannot look upon one without also seeing the other. We saw this with Mary, and we see it also with John the Baptist. Christ has come to us through John the Baptist, just as it is through the very words of this gospel, the gospel of John the evangelist, that Christ comes to us. If we were to try and scrap John the evangelist, we would lose our living contact with Jesus as given to us in the gospel. And so the path by which God has come to us, and by which we in turn go to him, is not merely Christ, but it is all those to whom Christ has united himself, and through whom and in whom he continues to communicate himself to the world. This is but another application of the sacramental and incarnational principle that makes Catholic Christianity so unique and so beautiful. This is also one of the most convincing signs of its divine origin. For the natural human tendency is to try and strip off creation as we make our ascent to God. But God, when he comes to us and establishes a religion, makes it one that is tremendously earthy, because rooted in the very soil of the creation that he himself has made and redeemed. For is it not the nature of a true lover to embrace and cherish everything about his beloved? Therefore, when God comes to us to unite us to himself, he takes the whole of his bride to himself and makes her radiant and beautiful with his own love. The whole created world, in the redeeming light of Christ, becomes radiant and pure and holy. This explains why the Catholic Church has sacraments, and why she has saints, and why she has feasts, and why she has different states of life, and why she has been the central driving force behind the development of the arts and sciences, as well as of the institutions that are aimed at the betterment of humanity, such as schools and hospitals. She is nothing but the space of redeemed creation, in which the fragmentation of sin is overcome by the magnetic movement of Christ, who draws all to himself and makes us one within his own divine embrace. And those who are united to Christ become a meeting place between God and the creation, for his own mystery is perpetuated in them. They stand at the spot where the exegesis meets the eisegesis, where the outflow of love awakens the inflow of love in response. They become mediators within the one mediator, channels of grace within the one from whom all grace and salvation flow. This is how deeply Christ has united himself to us, that our very humanity, our very unique existence in this world, becomes a perpetuation of his own life in enduring intimacy with God and with our brothers and sisters, and draws the two closer together until the union is consummated definitively at the end of time.